AFAM 201, Introduction to African American Studies. This is a lecture presented by Todd C. Shaw. I'm an associate professor of political science and African American studies at the University of South Carolina, Columbia. And this lecture is the intellectual property of Todd C. Shaw. So, welcome, class. I wanted to give you an opportunity to hear this lecture in its entirety, but I also wanted to make sure that we could move things along because I know we're a little bit behind in class. So, given that this is a very important topic that I don't want to give short shrift to, I thought I'd use a little technology and tape the lecture for you to look at or listen to as an outside assignment or homework assignment prior to class, and then we could come and do some review and use class time to review. So now, if you have heard good portions or all of this lecture up to the point I've given it, then you don't have to, of course, go through the entire slide. You can forward to the points or to the point that you have not heard. But I'm going to go ahead and do the lecture in its entirety and try and do it fairly quickly because you can backtrack or stop or take notes as you go along. Of course, this is topic 3, intersectionality, gender, sexuality, and class. And you remember from the last time that I showed the Beyonce video, you can go back and click on some of the key videos that I'm not going to show at this time. I may show a few, but I'm not going to show them all. But you can go back to the lecture notes and click the hyperlinks to see the video text and to get a little bit more background. Of course, that formation video got a lot of discussion. It's gotten a lot of discussion about it breaking the internet, but in the various ways in which Beyonce kind of presents a sort of creolized version of African American identity and shows the complexity of African American identity. So that's why I thought it was a perfect video to introduce our intersectionality topic. This is a quote from me. I think the class chuckled last time I said it, but it's something I think I continuously have found to be true of African American life and the experience, which blackness comes in many colors and forms, and that's key to keep in mind with intersectionality. So I'm presenting here a picture that discusses the thinking of noted feminist activist, civil rights activist, lesbian activist Audre Lorde. She was a wonderful poet who left us in 1992 due to cancer. But Audre Lorde has fundamentally shaped our thinking around intersectionality as an intersectional feminist. She lived an intersectional life, or she was purposeful in living her intersectional life. And so her quote is, "I am a black feminist. I recognize that my power as well as my primary oppressions come as a result of my blackness as well as my womanness, and therefore my struggles of both of these fronts are inseparable." She can't separate, or she, like so many others, can't separate one identity from another. It's not a matter of being black or LGBT, black or poor, or black and a woman, but how all of these things can interact. And so we're going to talk in this video, or excuse me, in this presentation about the questions of being an African American woman, questions of being LGBT and black, so black woman, black LGBT, and then black poverty. What is entailed in terms of the class divides in black poverty, or being black and poor in black America. These are the intersections we're going to think about. There, of course, are others. So in this lecture, the objective is to examine how African American lives have always been framed by multiple identities and oppressions, alongside those related to race, and to understand the tensions of recognizing the complexity of black lives. That there is this complexity that Shaw will continue to stress to you throughout this class, that even as we look through a lens of race, we've got to keep these other intersections in mind, because they give us the fuller picture, the broader landscape, the broader reality. So let's revisit intersectionality as a concept. Let's discuss the problems of respectability politics, or the cult of respectability, as Hazel Carby, but many other theorists have now picked up on that concept. And then, what does it mean to be a black woman confronting sexism? What does it mean to be a black LGBT person and to confront the problem of heterosexism? What does it mean to be black and poor and to confront the question of classism? Okay, so I'm beginning in our discussions of intersectionality by looking again at the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw is a professor of law at Columbia, at the University of Columbia, but she's also a director of a center over intersectionality studies. And she wrote an important article. She's a director of the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies at Columbia Law School. But she wrote a important article in 1993, and she's written many, but this particular article helped give a framework for intersectionality. It was entitled Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. Now, in that article, Crenshaw presents us with a definition that I've paraphrased here. Intersectionality. It's a feminist scholarly paradigm. And whenever we use that word paradigm, we mean a lens, a window through which we look through. It's a feminist scholarly lens or paradigm, as well as a lived experience that recognizes identities, inequalities, and structures of oppression interact or overlap. It's not one oppression over one oppression versus the other, but that they can intersect or overlap to provide multiple combinations of identities, inequalities, and oppressions. It is both understanding the complexity and the commonality of the Black lived experience that provides the greatest prospects for empowerment. Crenshaw talks about it in three ways. One, that there's this notion of structural intersectionality, how structures created, whether those structures be churches or schools or governments or businesses. What are the various structures in society that create our sense of being, a sense of, well, to borrow from Du Bois, at least double, or this doubleness or this multiple sense of ourselves. How does the criminal justice system both interact on black and black women and black men, both in a gendered, in a racial way, and also in a class way? Then let's think about political intersectionality, how leaders in various camps respond. How did leaders in various camps respond, as I've used this example before, to the 1972 bid from Congressman Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American woman to be elected to Congress from Harlem? How did they respond to Shirley Chisholm when Shirley wasn't just either a woman or black, but she was a black woman running for president of the United States, trying to get the Democratic nomination? Neither the women's movement nor the Black Power movement endorsed Shirley Chisholm. And so those leaders responded antagonistically to her bid and created a sort of political crisis in terms of intersectionality. And then representational intersectionality. How does popular culture influence our thinking about our doubleness? Does hip hop culture suggest that only black men can be thugs, or only black men have to be hyper masculine in order to be black men? They can't be black men and be gay, or they can't be black men and be feminist. So what are the various ways in which popular culture and culture, maybe more broadly, can influence intersectionality? Now, we talked and had a great discussion in class about examples of intersectionality, but also examples of what we would call respectability politics. And I'll go over that in a moment. But, the examples of how, if we were to think about Du Bois as well as Ta-Nehisi Coates' thinking about how black bodies are controlled, are being controlled, or there are politics around the black body. And so, whether it's the example of African-American young women and men, or often young women and men, wearing their pants down past their underwear line, or past showing their undergarments, and the ways in which that, of course, is borrowed partly from prison culture. You don't have a belt to wear in prison, so your pants sag. But how has this sagging prompted some municipalities, Flint, Michigan being one of many, to say that no, morally we've got to do something about this. It's problematic that these young black women and men are wearing their pants down, and so you have these ordinances being passed to say, you know, you can only wear it but so long, so far down before it gets into, underwear exposed, disorderly conduct, and indecent exposure. Citations that police officers can issue if in fact they find it problematic, right? In this case, 93 days to a year in jail and a $500 fine. Okay, the control of the black body, the respectability that it must exude, or it is a body out of place. Again, Dr. Barbara Combs. Or when we think about this recent discussion about Jaden Smith, the son of Jada and Jada Pinkett and Will Smith, about Jaden has been styling women's clothes and wearing what some would consider sort of a feminine line of dress by literally wearing dresses. That's not a respectable thing for a young black man to do. He is not representing his masculinity well by doing this. And so yet another argument about how the black body should be presented respectably. Or the whole discussion around HIV and AIDS in the African American community, which is, of course, literally about black bodies, about black health, about fears around homosexuality or HIV or intravenous drug use in terms of the pathways to sexual transmission of the virus, and the ways in which folk have shied away, particularly in African American churches, shied away from having these discussions around safer sex, around being individuals protecting themselves, partly because of this idea of we don't want to condone homosexuality and we don't want to condone intravenous drug use. We want to be respectable and shy away from these fundamental health concerns when African Americans have been at the center of the epidemic in terms of HIV/AIDS. And in fact, I'm showing you here a picture of Professor Kathy Cohen. Professor Kathy Cohen is at the University of Chicago. She's been the chair of the Department of Political Science, and she served as a deputy provost for graduate education, and the former director of the Center for Studies of Race. And among her books, Dr. Cohen has written a seminal book, The Boundaries of Blackness, AIDS and the Breakdown of Black Politics, where she talks about the various ways in which there is this respectability that is in effect in African American communities, and she talks about it in this way: that the politics of respectability, not a term that she coined. It in part comes from the thinking of a historian by the name of Hazel Carby, but there are many individuals, political scientists among them, who have borrowed from it. And it's a theory that describes the internal racial politics of the black community. It's an argument that there is, of course, racism and racial oppression. Yes, in the last lecture, we talked about that, that race does fundamentally matter and shape black life. And that is a primary form of marginalizing, of pushing away from power or marginalizing the humanity of black people. But there can be black concerns around this marginalization, quite naturally, about the ways in which black people are perceived or misperceived in terms of beliefs, culture, or behavior. And you also have this problem of black cultural appropriation by whites, borrowing from black culture or stealing from black culture and claiming it as one's own, not giving credit to African Americans for those various things that their culture produces. But Cohen says primary marginalization can lead to also a form of marginalization called secondary marginalization. Due to a great concern over white perceptions of black people, some black elites overcompensate and decide to police the boundaries of what is acceptable black behavior and expression. Whether it's, so they ask the question, is it moral? Is it respectable? Is it dignified? Is it properly masculine or feminine behavior that is, being presented out there in the broader society? Is it doing black folk harm by presenting these images that aren't respectable, and thus to determine, and thus so the black elites, some of whom may sort of say, well, if it's not respectable, is it worthy of our admiration, our support, our resources, our backing of the community? Is it a gatekeeper function to determine who is and is not respectable, and who is or is not in the interest of Black people? So then there also can be problematic discussions that occur where Black leaders, particularly when Black leaders who are human, do things that are problematic to the interest of the community. Whether it be questions of a Black leader accused of sexual assault or rape, a Black leader accused of molestation, a Black leader accused of using narcotics, as was the case for the case of Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, or these are various examples, not all the same of the same issue, but Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill controversy, or the Mayor Marion Barry of Washington, D.C. controversy, or the Bishop Eddie Long of Atlanta, Georgia controversy. If we talk about the fact that these leaders need to be held accountable for their actions, some may say, well, that's airing dirty laundry. Once again, you're giving in to that primary marginalization. You're making Black people look bad. And so here's the dilemmas and the politics that come with that race provides, but that some answer in a particular way. And that answer is not particularly satisfying in many ways, because it leaves out other issues. Now, real quickly, I want to talk about theories of gender relationships, because gender is going to be one of those factors we discuss in the next several sections. So I'm just giving a general sort of theory, three broad theories, or three broad ways to think about how does gender or genders relate, particularly the notion of the masculine to the feminine. They may relate to each other in the sense that they are seen as part of a whole. They may relate to each other as being seen as opposite to each other. And they may relate because they're seen as overlapping or intersecting. So the first, of course, is complementary. This idea that to fully be a Black man, one must understand oneself in relationship to Black women. Or to be fully masculine, one must cordon off what is masculine from what is feminine. But you need the two in complement to each other. The use of the notion of, well, that's my better half. It's my complement. There's a symbiosis between the two, although a clear distinction, as evident from the line in the middle. Then you can think about it in the sense of the notion of the opposite sex. If the first term is problematic, the second term is even more problematic, maybe to some degree, in the sense that they're all things feminine do not in any way interact with all things masculine. They are literally opposite or polar opposites to each other. They're in opposition or oppositional to each other. Then thirdly, intersectional, where, and again, I want to be careful because this is not all that could be discussed about these relationships. But here are three broad ways these relationships may relate to each other when we're talking about the connection of the feminine to the masculine. Is it intersectional? In the sense that, yes, there are some things that may broadly in the society be seen as feminine, or, however those stereotypes construct them. And there may be ways in which there are things that are masculine, however stereotypes, or maybe even empowering images discuss them. But let's be real that it's a continuum. They overlap. They're intersecting with each other. There are ways in which there is clearly ways that they're not just simply polar to each other, but connected in many ways. So, one proviso I want to provide is that one's gender identity need not relate to one's sexual orientation. And we'll keep that in mind as we move forward. Next, let's talk about African American women and sexism. And I gave you this quote earlier, and we've talked in class already a good amount about the life and times of Anna Julia Cooper. You know that Anna Julia Cooper was an African American woman who was a scholar, an educator. She was the first African American woman to earn her PhD, and she earned it from the University of Paris Sorbonne in 1924-1925. She became the principal of the Dunbar Street School, which was Wall Street School in Washington, D.C., which was a really kind of vaunted position because it was such an important place for African American young women and men to be trained and to become future leaders in this segregated community of Washington, D.C. She lived 106 years old, so the span of her life is really sort of a span of a segment of African American experience. But Anna Julia Cooper was sort of a proto-feminist or a proto-womanist. She preceded others in the sense that she set out a framework. And I always have liked this quote that comes from her 1892 book, A Voice from the South. Only the black woman can say when and where I enter, in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or special privilege, then and there the whole Negro race enters with me. Let's keep Anna Julia Cooper in mind as we talk about these intersections of gender and race. So let's discuss what is true of the lives of black women. And I want to just give some basic information. I am a political scientist. I am a social scientist. Let's talk about just some basic sort of demographic, political, economic facts about the lives of black women. So in terms of a few background facts, African American women comprise 13% of the female population in the U.S. They comprise 53% of all African Americans as of 2010. So African American women are a little bit more, are the majority of folk within the African American community, or African American females, I should say, are the majority of folk in the African American community. In terms of their health status, hypertension, just as one fact, hypertension is more prevalent among African American women than any other group of women. African American women represent 65% of new AIDS diagnoses among women. While white women are more likely to have breast cancer, African American women have higher overall mortality rates from breast cancer. In terms of educational attainment, only 21.4% of African American women had a college degree or higher in 2010, compared to 30% of white women. And according to census data about working life earnings, white women make more than African American women among full-time year-round workers, regardless of what degrees they have obtained. Let's talk about African American women's empowerment, innovation, and ingenuity, however. And I'm giving you two individuals. One is Madam C.J. Walker, and we'll talk probably a little bit more about Madam C.J. Walker because she was a formidable businesswoman. She became one of the first women millionaires, let alone African American women millionaires of the 20th century. She was an individual who built a cosmetic empire, but she was also a social philanthropist, someone who gave money. She gave money to causes such as Marcus Garvey's UNIA, as we'll discuss. And she represents, again, that important intersection of black women's seeing themselves as contributors in fundamental ways to the whole race. Here's a quote from her: "Don't sit down and wait for the opportunities to come. Get up and make them." Now, that sort of innovation, that sense of spirit, of ingenuity, of empowerment is similar to, and that was true of Madam C.J. Walker at the turn of the century into the 1920s and 1930s. Now let's talk about Susan Taylor, who's the founder editor and the founding editor in chief of Essence magazine, African American woman's premier magazine. And so Susan Taylor sort of represents some of that legacy of Madam C.J. Walker in founding of this important publication for African American women's empowerment and the empowerment of the whole community. Taylor once said, "Thoughts have power. Thoughts are energy, and you can make your world or break it by your own thinking." So I gave you those quotes because I want to stress that African American life is not simply about the drudgery of things, about oppression, about being acted upon. African American life is about, it has joy, it has ups and downs, it has various ways in which African Americans empower and resist. But thinking about, this ways of ingenuity, let's talk a little bit about entrepreneurship among African American women. African American owned businesses are the fastest growing segment of the woman owned businesses markets, so black women, and are starting up at a rate 6 times higher than the national average. The number of African American women owned businesses in 2013 was estimated at 1.1 million, comprising 42% of businesses owned by women of color and 49% of all African American women owned businesses. Economics. African American women only earn $610 per week, whereas African American men made $666, and white women's median usual weekly earnings was $718 in the second quarter of 2013. So, of course, we're talking about after the Great Recession. Married or cohabiting African American households, check this out, have a median wealth of $31,000. Keep that in mind. While single African American women have a median wealth of only $100, $31,500 to $100, and African American women with children, however, have zero median wealth. We've talked about wealth disparities. They are fundamental, and this is some evidence of why these wealth gaps are gaping, not only between blacks and whites, but they're actually pretty darn large among African Americans or within African American communities. We'll talk about class later. Now, let's also sort of talk about a few more economic facts. African American women households are more than half, or 53.3% of working, among African American households, more than half, or 53.3% of working wives are breadwinners. Breadwinners in the sense that African American women and men have never had the luxury of following sort of the nuclear family role of the father brings the bread home. At least since slavery, there's been a matter that both individuals have had to work in order to make ends meet in black homes. The poverty rate for African American women is 28.6%, 13% in comparison with the poverty rate of white women and non-Hispanic women of 10.8%. Okay, so in politics, another area where we can talk about empowerment, about some degree of relative progress. Of the 98 women in Congress, only 14 are African American women. Of the 29 women of color currently serving in the House of Representatives, 16 are African American women. Only 2 out of 73 women serving in the statewide executive officers are African American women. And we'll talk more about this. During lecture, I talked about this National Congress of Black Women. Among as many individuals who served as the president of that organization was a woman by the name of C. Dolores Tucker. Recognizing the power of African American women, that African American women are fundamental in terms of electoral politics and voting in the community. That African American women turn out at higher rates. So you wouldn't be than do black men, and so you wouldn't be surprised that Shirley Chisholm helped set a pathway in terms of black presidential politics. It was no mystery why Shirley felt empowered to do what she did, even though she encountered great hurdles. And in this sort of small, tiny image, I'm showing you a picture of women of the White House. African American women still being very fundamental to centers of power in the broader community, and individuals like Valerie Jarrett, the closest advisor to the president, being an African American woman, and all the things that may represent. So let's talk conceptually about African American women's lives by talking about some key concepts that frame African American women's lives. And let's be real, the lives of the African American community. I'm giving you here a bit of a montage of African American women's sense of empowerment, from Ntozake Shange's play Colored Girls, who have considered suicide when the rainbow's not enough, to pictures of Angela Davis, Zora Neale Hurston, sort of black feminist thought, individuals like Septima Clark right here in South Carolina, who have blazed pathways of civil rights activism in education, or the Words and Fire anthology. By the way, Black Feminist Thought, this was a volume written by Patricia Hill Collins, a very important theorist, in some ways a bit of a foundational intellectual theorist in the modern times for Black feminist thought. So, what do we mean by, I'm getting ahead of myself here, what do we mean by Black feminism and womanism? Black feminism and womanism, I've said this before in lecture, I won't go over it in great detail, but it's an ideology that asserts that multiple identities and oppressions fundamentally matter, most especially race, class, and gender, and thus African American women's humanity, leadership, and contributions must be equally embraced in Black and other communities for full empowerment to occur. So in many respects, womanism and feminism are the same, although the term womanism came from the thinking of Alice Walker, an important article that she wrote in Search of Our Mother's Gardens, where she said, womanism is to feminism what lavender is to purple, meaning that Black women have always had, even before the notion of feminism, even when black women have been discriminated against in the women's movement, they've always had a womanist ethic. They have embraced principles that are feminist, but are inherent to African American women's culture and to thinking. And so that's why this term womenism is sometimes used in place of feminism. Although Patricia Hill Collins once said, a rose is still a rose. It's still part of a black. There are great similarities between the two concepts. Then sexism. If we're going to talk about these isms, you can't talk about racism without defining it. You can't talk about sexism without defining it. It's a system of beliefs, norms, and institutions that assume men inherently assume primacy or superiority over women, and thus all things considered masculine are superior to all things considered feminine. The example of Mr. in The Color Purple, for those of you who know that popular cultural reference, the way in which Mr. Fundamentally mistreated Celie and made her feel less than, clearly because she was a woman. There was the principal reason why she was less than. Now, the next term is patriarchy, a system of societal beliefs, norms, and institutions that assume men have the inherent moral, legal, and cultural right to serve as the heads or rulers of the family, the community, and the nation. James Evans in Good Times, the popular show in the 1970s of Good Times, James Evans was clearly the patriarch of the family. A rule by fathers, a rule by the head of the household. We had that discussion in class. And then sex versus gender. So what is the notion of quote unquote biological sex, although our notions of that expanding, versus gender? Society presumes, and I put quotes around that, many human beings have a biological sex of either male or female. More on transgender and transsexual people later. But gender are all the assumptions, beliefs, and values that society assigns to the role of each sex. And in fact, whereas sex is male and female, gender is feminine and masculine. Now we come to misogyny as a term. Those beliefs, norms, and actions that assume that women can be viewed as objects and are potentially a threat to masculine power and self-concept, thus must be subordinated, often violently, through domestic violence and rape. We talk about the example of the Ray Rice incident, but that's just one of many we could discuss. We could certainly discuss what's occurred with regards to Bill Cosby and all of that's entailed in these many important allegations of sexual assault by more than 24 women, and all of this discussion that's now occurring or debate around that. But we got to keep in mind that there are some facts we can establish, or there's some facts out there about sexual assault that cannot be denied and we can't get around. And we'll talk about the controversy with Bill Cosby, because it is really important to talk about that controversy. But it's really important to keep in mind, South Carolina leads the nation in the number of women who have died from domestic violence in this state. And so it's not just a matter of one word against the other. It is important to think about this form of violence within Black communities. And certainly Audre Lorde, as we've read, talks very directly about this notion of crimes against Black women because it is not recognized in the African American community. I want to encourage you to go back and click on these videos and take a look at these links. Okay, so we'll come back to our readings with regards to our main authors. We've had that piece from Audre Lorde on ageism, classism, sexism, and defining the lives of Black women. And again, Audre Lorde is this brilliant poet. We lost her in 1992, but she was a brilliant poet, a radical feminist, a womanist, a lesbian, a civil rights activist, and really has shaped our thinking about intersectionality and feminism. So she's a guiding star in many regards. Then these two gentlemen, first one, Mark Anthony Neal, the professor of African American Studies and the founding director of the Center for Arts, Digital Culture, and Entrepreneurship at Duke University. Of course, we're reading his work on his chapter from his book. We're reading a chapter entitled, what the hell is a black male feminist? And so we're talking about his own journey, but his journey of other men to ask questions about how does feminism inform our view of men with regards to intersections of race and gender. And then Professor Michael Eric Dyson. Of course, he's a well-known African-American public intellectual, a radio host. He's a professor of sociology at Georgetown University, and we're reading, of course, the book we've discussed with regards to, is Bill Cosby right, or has the black community lost its mind, or black middle class lost its mind? We're going to read and discuss that piece later on in the class. So let's discuss black LGBT folks. Remember, Du Bois talked about the souls of black folks. Let's talk about various folks and various forms of double consciousness that Du Bois gave us a clue about way back in 1903. But of course, we had to do some more exploring and provide some more insights from various social movements to fully form some notions of broader senses of what it means to be black. Again, I want you to click on this link. This link links to a speech by President Obama with regards to his evolution on same-sex marriage. And we can say that there have been many ways in which African Americans have moved forward. Well, I'll say that, but others will say have changed in terms of their movement on LGBT rights in this country. And of course, LGBT black folk are at that intersection in terms of race and sexual orientation, gender identity. But I was struck by an interview that Tyler James Williams, who, as you probably, if you've seen the comedy Everybody Hates Chris, talking about the life and times of Chris Rock, and he serves as sort of the younger Chris Rock in that drama or that comedy. He's also played in the film Dear White People, and he played a young black gay man in that film. Now, he was interviewed about that role, and he gave this quote, which I thought was striking. Whether we like to address it or not, the African American community is notoriously homophobic. We have been coming up on, let me read this right. We have been coming up on the rough side of the mountain as far as civil rights issues go, but we haven't necessarily addressed the fact that there's a whole other side to that civil rights coin, which are gay rights. And you often hear this discussion about, is it black civil rights or gay rights? The two are not the same. Well, how do we discuss that as an intersection? And there are various examples of black intersectionality with regards to the LGBT movement. There's the brilliant Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was a civil rights activist, social democrat, socialist, communist, very involved in the civil rights movement, was a lieutenant of A. Philip Randolph, a seminal African-American labor leader, as well as a lieutenant to Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, were it not for Bayard Rustin, the 1963 March on Washington, where King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, would not have been organized to the degree that it was. Bayard was the brilliance and organizing skills behind the scheme, but Bayard was bashed within the movement. They at various times said, they tried to gay bait King because Bayard was one of his aides. So he's lived an intersectional life, and he lived an intersectional life that we should be mindful of with regards to orientation and race. Another individual among many we could quote would be Barbara Smith, who is a seminal sort of African-American black women feminist, lesbian author, socialist, commentator, activist. She wrote she co-edited an important anthology. All the women are white and all the men are black. That really kind of helped to further put the intellectual understanding of black feminism on the map. And then in terms of the transgender community, Janet Mock, who's an important American writer, a transgender activist, an author, and a former staff editor for People magazine website. Brilliant personality who presents as a transgender woman who speaks about very directly the lives of transgender people. And we can discuss, there have been these images of black gay folk out in the black broader culture. Fox has its mega successful Empire series. And it isn't the only sort of primetime series featuring a major story involving black gay male characters. There's BET's Being Mary Jane and Tyler Perry's The Haves and Have-Nots are also taking what some might call sort of quote the bold step in representing this untapped demographic in non-stereotypical ways. So we see these images occurring more and more. So what is Tyler James Williams talking about when he says, well, but black folk are notoriously homophobic? Do you believe that? Think about that. Think about that claim that's being made. Let's proceed forward and discuss it later in class. So let's talk about some concepts. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender questioning is sometimes the acronym is LGBTQ. Lesbian folks who are attracted to same sex who are women. Gay meaning men who are attracted to the same sex. Bisexual meaning that they are attracted to individuals irrespective of sex. Transgendered individuals. We'll define that in a moment in terms of the disjuncture between who they feel in terms of their gender identity and what it says on birth certificates. And then questioning. Folk who are trying to sort it out for themselves. A person's enduring physical, romantic, and or emotional attraction to another person is what we call sexual orientation. The Williams Institute calculates that there's over 1 million African American adults who self-identify as LGBT, or about 4% of all blacks. There are about 84,000 households that are black same-sex households in the United States, according to the census. Let's define transgender, a term used to describe people whose transgender identity differs from the sex the doctor marked on their birth certificate. I borrowed that definition from an organization called GLAAD. Gender identity is a person's internal personal sense of being a man or a woman, or someone feeling sort of outside of the gender binary of you pick, are you man or woman. People in the transgender community may describe themselves using more than one or more, or a wide variety of terms, including but not limited to transgender, transsexual, genderqueer. It's always important to use the term that people want you to use. Ask and be mindful of what term makes the individual feel the most comfortable. Think about it. Transgender can be sort of an interesting parallel, because you and I have talked about the construction of race and how one can be quote unquote biracial, right? You can have various intersections of identity or multiracial. Why can't gender also take on that same sense if it too is a construction in some ways? It's ways in which society acts upon what it thinks is biological, right? Just like race, where they act upon what they think is biological. Click this YouTube clip. You'll find it interesting. So let's talk about marriage equality national trends. Where are we? You can see from this line, and I picked this chart because it is pretty clear, that if you look at the percentage of Americans who say they are for gender equality or marriage equality, starting in roughly 1990, you had somewhere upwards, the red line is opposed and the blue line was favor. You had a huge gap in terms of nearly 70% of folks were against, and somewhere only 30% of the folk were in favor. But as you go through the years, and these are various surveys that have been taken on the question, these are what we call sort of trend lines or regression lines. Overall, the line has dropped precipitously and fundamentally changed, particularly in the 2000s, where you see this downward slope in opposition and this upward slope in being in favor, where now you have more folk, you have a cultural shift, more folk in favor of marriage equality than in opposition to it. What is true of black folk, however? And let's compare African Americans to their white counterparts. In 2001, roughly 1/3 of both blacks and whites expressed support for same-sex marriage. African Americans and whites were in the same place. Today, 58% of whites support same-sex marriage, and 49% of blacks. So yes, you've seen an upward tick, but the increase in terms of those being in favor among whites has precipitously increased. it has only very slowly increased among African Americans. Is it because African Americans' religiosity, in the sense of strong moral prohibitions against homosexuality? Is it what stems out of the church belief of love the sinner, hate the sin? Is it the sense that that's really about also respectability politics in the black community? Sexuality is a taboo subject in social institutions. It's not discussed, and so because it's not discussed, in many ways, this means African Americans rely on very traditional views when it comes to sexuality, and particularly homosexuality. Let's think about it and think it through, because it's also true that African Americans strongly support civil rights. And so, where does that stand relative to this question of LGBT rights? Of course, some of those folks we talk about are black people who have these LGBT rights. So, homophobia. It's an unreasoning prejudice, bias, antipathy, or discrimination toward homosexuals that at its extreme results in individual or collective hostility and at times violence. There is debate as to whether African Americans are inherently more homophobic as compared to their white counterparts, partly due to African Americans' religiosity and the politics, quote unquote, of respectability. It plays into the politics with the majority vote around this issue that came up in 2008 with this Proposition 8 in California. Proposition 8 was a proposition that said, in effect, we will ban gay marriage or same-sex marriage in the state of California. Folk thought, hey, it's California. It's bound to be defeated. It was not. The African-American community, in part, was blamed because the polls show that African-Americans, at least by a majority, were in favor of the ban. But then others said, well, but you didn't actually, those of you in the white LGBT rights community did not organize in black communities. And so why are you blaming African Americans alone for it passing? Some whites had to pass it because African Americans are clearly a minority within the state of California. They couldn't have passed it by themselves. Still, how aggravating would it have been for a young black gay or lesbian or transgender person or bisexual person in 2008 to wake up and have seen the election of Barack Obama, but also to see that they were rejected among their people and among others for their rights of being able to marry who they love. That's my commentary, my editorial. But there's a short film on that called Change, if you're interested to hear more about it. Heterosexism is a system of attitudes, biases, norms, and discriminatory policies and institutions in favor of the heterosexual sexuality and relationships. It can include the presumption that all people are heterosexual or that opposite sex attractions and relationships are or should be the only norm and therefore superior. It undergirds or reinforces homophobia. So let's talk a little bit more in terms of LGBT, being black and LGBT. And I think there are various dimensions to African American life and thus also the African American LGBT life, in the sense that African American LGBT folk form families, form enduring relationships, get married, have important celebrations among themselves, have formed churches or form religious institutions and social institutions, and have leadership and heroes among LGBT folk. We've certainly talked about Barbara Smith, Bayard Rustin, Kathy Cohen. We had that clip from Wanda Sykes, James Baldwin, among others. I think that's Frank Ocean there. But, who are leaders, intellectuals within the community and lead the community as an important subpopulation among African Americans. Some of you may know of or have heard of this show called The Prancing Elites. It's a group of young African American men who do what are called a form of dancing called J-setting. J-setting, it's called J-setting because it comes from Jackson State University, where black gay men began to, in a cultural way, use the dance form found in black marching bands among black dancing troupes of women and adapt that to black gay culture. But of other ways in which black gay culture contributes to African American popular culture. The whole notion of voguing came out of black gay culture and what's called the ballroom community. Well, for all the ways in which there's progress and great joy, there's also fundamental challenges and discrimination within LGBT people, and particularly among transgender folk who are discriminated. 41% of transgender and gender nonconforming people have attempted suicide. 41%, when we're talking about less than 5% of all persons nationally. 1.6% of all people have tried to take their own lives. So that's a whopping figure among folk who are self-identified as transgender or gender nonconforming. Or transgender women who survive hate attacks are 6 times more likely to experience physical violence than interacting with the police than are other gay, lesbian, or bisexual survivors. And then keep in mind this figure: harassment and assault by police due to the bias by race. And so look that African American transgender people are the most likely to report and have the highest rates of reporting forms of violence and abuse. 60% have either been harassed, physically assaulted, or sexually assaulted, according to these national surveys. So, family matters, and let's talk about just a few facts about Black LGBT folk, and then we will conclude our discussion in terms of talking about the lives of Black poor people. About 34% of all Black same-sex households are raising children, 32% of Black same-sex male couples, and 47% for Black same-sex female couples. Economic well-being. Black same-sex couples raising children report household incomes of $15,000 lower than their comparable Black same different sex couples. So $47,000 versus $63,000, a whopping gap in those households. Female African American same-sex households, which comprise 48% of all African American same-sex couples, earn over $20,000 less than male African American same-sex couples. LGBT African Americans are also less likely than their non-LGBT counterparts to have health insurance, and thus that is a fundamental concern, particularly given the rates of HIV that segments of our community must confront, and of course the LGBT community being among them. Transgender status and discrimination. There are roughly 700,000 transgender people in the U.S. Arguably the most intense forms of anti-LGBT or anti-queer. I know I haven't used that term before, but that's also a term in the community, as is same-gender loving. Anti-queer discrimination are against the transgender community. It's even worse for Black transgender people, BTP, due to racism, classism, and heterosexism. In 2013, 2/3 of LGBT homicide victims were transgendered women of color. Black transgender people reported very high rates of discrimination in comparison to their white counterparts. So racism and transphobia that confront transgender people. In terms of job losses, they reported 32% versus 24% for their white counterparts. In terms of unemployment, they reported 24% of them of Black transgender people reported being unemployed as compared to 12% of their white counterparts. And housing discrimination, 38% of Black transgender folk reported some level of being discriminated in terms of their housing choices versus 15% for their white counterparts. So these are all the ways in which we can think about this intersection of being Black and LGBT, this sense of double or multiple consciousness. Now let's talk about Black poor folks. And so I want to conclude, because I think this is yet another intersection that we've got to think through as we talk about the ways in which Black life has many forms, takes many colors. African American poor people, like all poor people, have dignity, but there is no dignity in poverty. Another Shaw quote, in the sense that you cannot divorce the person from being a whole person, but no one wants to be in poverty. And poverty has many ways in which those who are in poverty are stigmatized or stereotyped. I'm giving you various images of poverty, past and present. But in this one in particular, this young Black girl sitting on the porch with her little baby brother or sister is particularly visceral. It could be taken somewhere here in South Carolina, probably not far up the road. But I want to point out 2 key images, and that's the image of the book by William Julius Wilson, The Truly Disadvantaged, The Inner City, the Underclass, and Public Policy. We'll talk about that later. And then this is a picture of the 1968 Poor People's March. that Dr. Martin Luther King called for, but the king was assassinated before he could hold that Poor People's March in Washington, D.C., asking for basic economic rights and a minimum and guaranteed income for the federal government for poor folk. King was joined by many organizations. The National Welfare Rights Movement really kind of led the movement, but King called for it, was assassinated before it occurred, and then it was led by his lieutenant, Ralph Abernathy, and Coretta Scott King, his wife. Having said all that, we have the comments that Dr. Bill Cosby gave with regards to poor folk. And I want to have you click on his actual comments, but I'm going to read this comment here. He gave this speech at Howard University at a commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education case. And some say that Cosby was sort of speaking hard truths. Others said Cosby was clearly victimizing and scapegoating black poor people. So here's just a quote. Here's a segment. You read. You click the larger link. They're standing on the corner and they can't speak English. I'm talking about black poor people. I can't even talk the way these people talk. Why you ain't where you is? I blamed the kid until I heard the mother talk. And then I heard the father talk. Everybody knows it is important to speak English except these knuckleheads. You can't be a doctor with that kind of crap coming out of your mouth. Now that's only a small segment of what Cosby said. I want you to listen even more. But let's talk about this concept that emerged prior to and at the rise of Dr. William Julius Wilson's book. He's a sociologist at Harvard University. And he wrote a book in 1987 called The Truly Disadvantaged. It was a term that was called the black underclass or the underclass, speaking of the persistently poor. And he argued that since the 1970s, a wide class divide has occurred in the black community. The middle class has done relatively well and migrated out of inner city neighborhoods to suburbs, but the plight of the black poor has not improved or worsened. He talked of concentration effects, or many of the problems that come from the black poor being economically segregated and socially isolated. And here are a few presumptions that come along with these concentration effects that we can unpack. But it's this idea, again, that the black middle class migrated out of the inner city and left the poor. And there are many ways in which the economic and social, quote unquote, ills of the black poor were simply concentrated and magnified because of this absence of these networks between the middle class and the black poor. So he says, here's 6 things that occurred to help create a black underclass. A persistent sense of intergenerational poverty, passing poverty from one generation to the next, and also passing welfare dependence, the dependence on the social welfare system from one generation to the next, from mother to daughter to granddaughter, or from father to or mother to son to granddaughter, to grandson. Ways in which black women were scapegoated as part of this transmission process. Secondly, high rates of out-of-wedlock births. Thirdly, impoverished female-headed households. Fourthly, high rates of unemployment or underemployment. 5, high rates of drug usage and criminal offending. And 6, high rates of conviction, imprisonment, and recidivism among those who were imprisoned or got out of prison but are simply in a revolving door going back into prison. These are all the traits of the quote-unquote black underclass, and you can see why I put quotes around it. Now, let's talk about the criticisms of this concept, even though Wilson was well-meaning, I believe, in trying to grapple with this question of persistent and really quite frustrating levels of African-American poverty. What damage in part was done in defining the black underclass or even using the term underclass? They were literally seen as folk who are outside the margin. They are under definition of class, the very bottom, quote unquote. And so Michael B. Katz in 1993, as a historian with other historians, had among what emerged as an ongoing debate about the underclass and what is that underclass debate. Here are some of the presumptions that critics found issue with in terms of Wilson's thinking. One, stigma. The term underclass stigmatizes the black poor in race, class, and gender terms as having behavioral and cultural deficits. It's about the black poor ain't got the right cultural values, without considering the historical inequalities that created the black poor, not just since the 1960s. In fact, there are pieces in that volume that says, well, black poverty goes back, to slavery. Black poverty goes back to ways in which African Americans were fundamentally denied rights under the New Deal. So you can't simply just say, well, the 1960s came, everything got equal, and black poor folk languished. And it's also not about what Ronald Reagan would use as a term of welfare mothers or welfare queens. He used the idea. Folk just simply, forgive me for using this term, but pimping the system, abusing the system, young thugs and welfare mothers. These terms are coded language, right? The ghetto is a coded word now. The acting ghetto is a coded word, and it's a class stereotype. It's a class criticism, of how these quote unquote ratchet folk operate. Secondly, dependence. First of all, it's a bit of a myth to say that folk were on welfare forever. In fact, research, Ron Mincy among others, research has found long-time welfare dependence is not true. For the most part, the research demonstrated that most families only had a 2-year cycle of reliance. That didn't mean reliance on public welfare. That didn't mean that they weren't poor. That just means that they only used over the course of their lives some means that would be food stamps or at that time aid to assistance for family with dependent children. They used these benefits for about a course of 2 years, and that was it. In fact, the current law, the Temporary Assistance to Needy Family Law, or the Welfare Reform Act of 1996, used that research to say we will put a 2-year limit on welfare benefits because that's exactly, research showed, the level at which people were making use of welfare on the average. So this idea of intergenerational dependence is a myth. Then opportunity structures. So Wilson thought a lot about concentration effects, but he still came back around to behavior, around, can we link up black men and women to marry black women out of poverty, as opposed to looking in more structural ways. And so these critics have said you need to take a look at the lack of opportunity structures and take into account the shaping of how black poor families have adapted. There are cumulative disadvantages to black poverty. I used to have a friend who said, it takes a lot of money to be poor. You spend a lot of money, you spend an inordinate amount of your money in taxes because you have less money and you have taxed at a higher rate. It requires more for credit. It requires a lot of things to be poor. And these are cumulative disadvantages that you have that never really get you out of poverty because of these cumulative disadvantages. And we can talk about them both in the sense of the neighborhoods people live in, the resources, public resources not provided, and then the opportunity networks they're not connected into. Fourthly, class integration. So Wilson says, well, black middle-class folk moved out of the inner city. Some of that is true, and left black poor people there without networks to get out of poverty. But the problem is, some have critiqued to say, well, Wilson, was there really that much interaction or integration between the black middle class and the black poor to suggest that avenue was going to be the means out of poverty? To some degree, there is some evidence, of course, there are ways in which black families know both middle class status and poverty status, the ways in which, relatives and kinship networks work to help folk out. So yeah, there is an element of truth to that, but is it all about the fact that folk moved out of the community and left folk? Is it really still about those structural problems? We can talk about class biases of black middle class people, but was it simply the fact that the nature of the problem was much larger than this simply the migration of black middle class folks? And then resilience. The black poor are overwhelmingly the working poor. That's what we really kind of talk about in the United States. It's not about people who don't have jobs. Temporary assistance to needy families now does not provide the same social safety network would be the case. Folk got to work for the most part in many respects to eat, or they do not eat, or they are homeless in many respects. There is very little social safety network or social safety or public safety network or net, pardon me. But at the same time, we're not recognizing that poor folk are hardworking folk who are being underpaid or who are being underemployed, and that they are working hard to maintain their families and their communities and their sense of self. Few more statistics, then I'm going to end the lecture. One is the history of Black poverty and the Black family. I borrowed this chart from blackdemographics.com, but it shows that people in Black families with female-headed households or no male present versus people in Black families overall, and the percentage of Black people in Black families in poverty, 1959 to 2012. So if you looked at what was true in terms of quote-unquote female-headed households, 70% of them were in poverty in the early 1960s. About half of Black Black people, Black families overall were in poverty. But when you look at these rates, they dramatically come down from 70% of everyone to 41%. Now, 41% is still horrible as compared to 54 to 25 for Black families overall. But this idea that, well, poverty is just getting worse and worse and worse in the Black community, that is a bit of myth. The myth is that the percentage of African Americans in poverty has fundamentally increased over the last several decades. It really hasn't. Elements of it have clearly persisted, and thus the absolute number of Black persons have increased because why? The absolute number of Black people have increased. There's a larger number of Black folk in the United States today than would have been true 30 years ago. So that's a percent of a larger group. So this is what we're really seeing, is that whereas there were about 1 million Black folk in poverty in 1984, there are now 11 million Black people in poverty in 2014, given population growth. Let's be clear, that's bad enough. But let's be real about the statistics. And no, all, Black folk do not account for the largest, the total number of poor people in the United States are not Black people. They're white people. Total number of people who are upon welfare are not Black people. They're white people. It would make sense given demographics and given the sizes of each population. Then poverty rates overall, the percentage in poverty, and you can go back and look at this chart, but 24% for African Americans versus all races, 33% with related with children under 18, married couples less likely with children, 11%, female-headed households, 38%, with children, 47%. And then, a really quite disheartening fact, 39% of those who are 18 and under who are African American being in poverty, et cetera, et cetera. But here it even highlights it even more. The percentage of poor children living in areas of concentrated poverty, 40% and higher census tracts of poverty. From 2006 to 2010, 45% of all African American children live in areas of concentrated poverty, or the concentrated effects of poverty, as Wilson would say. So Black poverty has only slightly decreased in relation to white poverty, and Black children live in the most impoverished communities. This is disheartening. Let's be real about what is true of Black poverty and what is not true about Black poverty, what is true of the lives of Black poor folks and what is not true. And then, just to conclude, let's look at the class divide. For all of the economic inequality between Blacks and whites, and you and I have already talked about it, there are gaping wealth inequalities among Blacks and whites. The income equality among Blacks is quite large and growing. We can unpack this in class, but I just wanted to show you this graphic. It looks at Black, these are called quintiles. If you broke the income distribution into fifths, what is the bottom of that distribution? We'll talk about this more in class. But just look at this line among African Americans. So Blacks in 1986, here's what the Black quote-unquote upper class were making versus the Black more middling and working classes and poor. So that particular line shows you the differences. But look how more wider that gap is in 2007. This line is higher, and it's in other words, the slope of this line is steeper. So there are African Americans doing quite well and much better, and there are black poor folk who are doing as worse as before. And so there is this growing gap between the Oprah Winfreys, if you will, not to pick on Oprah, but the Oprah Winfreys of the world, and folk who are found at the bottom. Chris Rock made a joke about black richness and wealth. I ain't gonna bring it up here, but we can talk about it in class. So, do most upper and middle class blacks experience race in very different ways because of these gaping inequalities of wealth and gaping inequalities of income? Do folks see things differently because of middle class status or upper class status? You saw this before, but I just want to highlight this. And I said you saw it before. It's in the first lecture. This comes from the 2008 Black Politics Survey, the Center for African American Studies. It was a total of 1,000 African Americans surveyed, where when asked, folks said, more in common with social class than racial group? Do you think you have more in common with your class? So at least about a third of African Americans said yes, whereas 60% agreed. So there might be this ways in which, of course, class is working in a particular way in the black community, even given the inequalities of race. And so class, I wanted you just to have an opportunity outside of class to do a little homework and listen to this lecture about intersectionality. We will talk and unpack some more for class and for our purposes in terms of what's coming up in the class. But thank you for taking the time I asked you to take to listen to this lecture, and I will see you on a rebound in class. Bye-bye.